The morning sun had barely risen over the small town of Riverside when Detective Marcus Chen received the call that would lead to one of the strangest cases of his career. A woman had been reported at the local Veterans Hall, wearing a full Navy SEAL uniform and claiming to have served in some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at a corner table in the Veterans Hall, her uniform crisp and decorated with medals that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. She spoke with confidence to anyone who would listen, describing combat operations in places most people only saw on the news. The older veterans gathered around her, their faces showing a mixture of respect and curiosity, as she recounted tales of jumping from helicopters into enemy territory and conducting raids on terrorist compounds. But something didn't sit right with Tom Harrison, a retired Marine who had served 3 tours in Iraq. He noticed small details that seemed off. The way Sarah wore her uniform had subtle mistakes that no real SEAL would make. A ribbon was placed slightly wrong. Her boots, though polished, were a style that hadn't been issued in years. Most importantly, when she spoke about SEAL training, she used terms that sounded like they came from movies rather than actual experience. Tom excused himself from the group and made a quiet phone call to a friend who still had connections to the Naval Special Warfare Command. Within an hour, that call had made its way through official channels, and by afternoon, Detective Chen was walking through the doors of the Veterans Hall with 2 uniformed officers beside him. Sarah looked up as the officers approached her table. Her confident smile faltered for just a moment before she straightened her shoulders and stood to greet them. Detective Chen introduced himself politely and asked if they could speak privately. Sarah agreed, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her belongings. In a small office at the back of the hall, Detective Chen laid out the situation carefully. They had contacted the Navy's Personnel Records Office. There was no record of a Sarah Mitchell ever completing SEAL training or serving in any special operations capacity. In fact, there was no record of her serving in the military at all. Sarah's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them like a vast canyon. Finally, she whispered that she wanted to call her lawyer. Detective Chen nodded and informed her that she was being arrested for violating the Stolen Valor Act, a federal law that makes it illegal to fraudulently claim military service or awards for personal gain. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. Sarah had been a fixture in the community for nearly 2 years, attending every veterans event, speaking at schools about service and sacrifice, and even raising money for military charities. Local business owners had given her discounts reserved for service members. The high school had invited her to speak at their Memorial Day assembly. Parents had encouraged their children to listen to her stories about courage and dedication. Now those same parents felt betrayed and angry. How could someone lie about something so sacred? The local newspaper ran a front-page story with Sarah's photo from her arrest. The headline read, "Local woman charged with faking military service." Comments flooded social media, most of them expressing outrage and calling for harsh punishment. But there were other voices too, quieter ones that asked different questions. Why would someone do this? What could drive a person to create such an elaborate fiction? Sarah's neighbor, an elderly woman named Dorothy, told reporters that Sarah had always seemed lonely, always searching for somewhere to belong. As Sarah sat in a holding cell waiting for her arraignment, miles away in San Diego, a phone rang in the office of Rear Admiral James Sullivan. The Admiral had spent 32 years in the Navy, including 15 years with the SEAL teams. He had seen combat in multiple theaters and had led men through situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. His aide briefed him on the case that had been flagged for his attention. A woman with no military service had impersonated a Navy SEAL for over 2 years, accepting recognition and benefits meant for those who had actually served. The aide expected the Admiral to be furious. Cases of stolen valor always angered military personnel, especially when someone falsely claimed to be part of the elite SEAL community. But Admiral Sullivan's reaction was not what anyone expected. He sat quietly for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he asked his aide to get him all the information available about Sarah Mitchell. Not just the charges and the evidence, but everything about her background, her life, what had led her to this point. The aide looked surprised but complied. Over the next several days, a picture emerged that was more complicated than a simple case of fraud. Sarah Mitchell had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home, never finding a place where she truly belonged. She had struggled with depression and anxiety throughout her 20s. She had held various jobs but never found a career that gave her purpose. 2 years ago, she had stumbled into the Veterans Hall while looking for a community service opportunity. She had intended to volunteer, to help in some way. But when someone mistook her for a veteran and thanked her for her service, something inside her had shifted. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, valued, and part of something greater than herself. What started as a failure to correct a simple misunderstanding had snowballed into an elaborate deception. Sarah had bought a uniform online, researched SEAL operations through documentaries and books, and crafted a persona that gave her the identity and purpose she had always craved. She never asked for money directly, though she had accepted the recognition and small gestures that came with being perceived as a hero. Admiral Sullivan read through the reports with a deepening sense of understanding. He had seen many things in his years of service, including the very real toll that combat took on those who served. He had also seen how powerful the need for belonging could be, how it drove young men and women to push through the brutal crucible of SEAL training in the first place. This case was wrong, certainly. Sarah had broken the law and dishonored those who had actually earned the right to wear the uniform. But Admiral Sullivan also saw something else, something that most people caught up in their righteous anger were missing. He saw a broken person who had found the wrong way to fix something inside herself. The Admiral made a decision that would surprise everyone involved in the case. He picked up his phone and called the district attorney handling Sarah's prosecution. He wanted to make a statement about the case, but not the kind of statement anyone was expecting. Meanwhile, Sarah's arraignment had become a media spectacle. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, cameras ready to capture the woman who had dared to pretend she was a Navy SEAL. Veterans groups had organized to attend the hearing, many wearing their real uniforms and ribbons, a silent rebuke to the woman who had worn false ones. Sarah walked into the courtroom with her public defender, a young attorney named Rachel Torres, who looked overwhelmed by the attention the case had attracted. The judge, a stern woman named Margaret Chen, who had a reputation for harsh sentences in fraud cases, reviewed the charges with a disapproving frown. The prosecution laid out their case efficiently. They had documentation proving Sarah had never served in the military. They had testimony from veterans who had believed her stories. They had evidence that she had received tangible benefits, including discounts and preferential treatment based on her false claims. Sarah's attorney could offer little in defense, except to note that her client had not profited financially in any significant way, and that she was deeply remorseful for her actions. Rachel Torres painted a picture of a troubled woman seeking connection in the wrong way, but even she seemed to know it was a weak defense against the clear violation of federal law. The judge set bail at a modest amount, which Sarah's parents managed to pay after driving through the night from their home 3 states away. They were elderly and confused, struggling to understand how their daughter had created this alternate life. They had thought she was working as a medical records clerk, which was true, but they had no idea about her second life in the veterans community. As Sarah left the courthouse, a crowd of protesters shouted at her. Someone threw an empty water bottle that bounced off her shoulder. She kept her head down, trying not to cry, trying not to completely fall apart under the weight of shame and regret that pressed down on her like a physical force. That evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment surrounded by the uniform and medals she had to surrender as evidence, she wondered how her life had gone so terribly wrong. She had never meant to hurt anyone. She had just wanted to matter, to be part of something meaningful, but in trying to fill the emptiness inside herself, she had committed a crime that had hurt the very community she had grown to genuinely care about. The story dominated local news for days. Psychologists and veterans were interviewed, offering theories about what drove people to commit stolen valor. Some spoke about mental illness, others about moral failing. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about what should happen to Sarah Mitchell. But back in San Diego, Admiral Sullivan was working on something that would change the entire narrative of the case. He had made phone calls to people he trusted, people who understood both the seriousness of what Sarah had done and the complexity of why she had done it. He was preparing to make a statement that would force everyone to look at the situation from a different angle. The Admiral's aide tried to warn him that his planned response might be controversial, that some would see it as being too soft on someone who had disrespected the SEAL community. But Admiral Sullivan had made his decision based on decades of leadership experience and a deep understanding of human nature forged in the fires of combat and command. He knew that justice was important, but he also knew that justice without wisdom was just revenge, and he had seen enough revenge in his career to know that it rarely healed anything. What he was planning would challenge everyone's assumptions about the case, including Sarah Mitchell's own understanding of what she had done and why. 3 weeks after Sarah's arrest, Admiral Sullivan requested a meeting with the district attorney, the lead detective on the case, and representatives from several veterans organizations. The meeting was scheduled at a naval facility in San Diego, and those invited arrived with different expectations about what the Admiral wanted to discuss. District Attorney Robert Caldwell assumed the Admiral wanted to ensure the prosecution pursued maximum penalties. Detective Chen thought the Admiral might offer additional resources for investigating whether there were other victims or financial crimes involved. The veterans' representatives expected the Admiral to express the military community's outrage and demand justice for the offense committed against their brothers and sisters in arms. Admiral Sullivan entered the conference room in his service uniform, his bearing showing every bit of his decades of leadership. His face was serious but calm as he greeted each person and thanked them for coming. He asked everyone to hold their questions until he had finished speaking. Then he began. He started by acknowledging the seriousness of what Sarah Mitchell had done. He made it clear that he understood the anger and sense of betrayal that genuine veterans felt when someone fraudulently claimed their service and sacrifices. He spoke about the SEAL ethos, the genuine warriors he had served alongside, and some who had given their lives in service to their country. His voice carried weight that came from lived experience, from knowing personally what it meant to earn the trident that symbolized SEAL qualification. The room was silent, everyone nodding in agreement with his words. This was exactly what they expected to hear from a decorated SEAL admiral. But then, Admiral Sullivan shifted direction in a way that caught everyone off guard. He began talking about his years of command, about the different types of people he had encountered in his career. He spoke about young sailors who had joined the Navy searching for direction, for family, for purpose. He talked about how the military provided structure and belonging for people who had never experienced either. He described how powerful it was to be part of something greater than yourself, to wear a uniform that identified you as someone worthy of respect. Admiral Sullivan then pulled out a folder containing the background investigation his office had conducted on Sarah Mitchell. He walked through her life history, painting a picture of profound isolation and a desperate search for identity. He noted that she had never directly asked anyone for money, that she had actually donated to veterans' causes from her modest salary, and that by all accounts, she had genuinely tried to be helpful and supportive in the veterans' community. District Attorney Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was not the conversation he had expected. One of the veterans' representatives, a former Army sergeant named David Martinez, spoke up. He pointed out that Sarah's motivations didn't excuse her actions, that plenty of people had difficult backgrounds without resorting to stealing the honor that others had earned through blood and sacrifice. Admiral Sullivan nodded in acknowledgement. He agreed completely that Sarah's background did not excuse what she had done. But then he asked a question that made everyone in the room pause. He asked what they thought the goal of the justice system should be in this case. Was it purely punishment? Was it deterrence? Or was there also an opportunity for something else? Something that might actually address the underlying issues and possibly prevent similar situations in the future? The Admiral proposed an alternative approach to the case. He suggested that Sarah Mitchell needed serious psychological help, not just punishment. He argued that her actions, while illegal and hurtful, were more a symptom of mental health issues and a profound need for belonging than they were calculated fraud for material gain. He proposed that the prosecution consider a resolution that included mandatory mental health treatment, community service that genuinely helped veterans, and an opportunity for Sarah to make real amends. The room erupted in argument. Several people thought the Admiral was being too soft, that his proposal would send a message that stolen valor wasn't taken seriously. Others worried about the precedent it might set. District Attorney Caldwell pointed out that he had a legal obligation to prosecute violations of federal law, and that public sentiment was strongly in favor of significant punishment. But Admiral Sullivan persisted. He explained that true strength wasn't always about harsh punishment. Sometimes it took more courage to choose a path of restoration and healing, especially when that path was unpopular. He shared a story from his own experience about a young SEAL who had made a serious mistake during training, one that could have ended his career. Sullivan had chosen to work with that young man rather than simply dismiss him, and that sailor had gone on to become one of the finest operators Sullivan had ever served with. Detective Chen, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. He mentioned that in his investigation, he had interviewed many people who had interacted with Sarah at veterans' events. While they felt betrayed by her deception, several had also noted that she had been genuinely kind and helpful. She had visited sick veterans in the hospital, not because she was asked to or because cameras were present, but because she seemed to genuinely care. She had spent hours listening to older veterans tell their stories, giving them attention and respect. One of the veterans' representatives, a retired Navy corpsman named Jennifer Walsh, shared her own perspective. She said that while she was angry about what Sarah had done, she also recognized something in the story that troubled her. The veterans community sometimes struggled to be welcoming to outsiders who wanted to support them but hadn't served. Maybe, she suggested, there were people like Sarah who desperately wanted to be part of something meaningful but didn't know how to connect authentically. The conversation shifted as people began considering Admiral Sullivan's proposal more seriously. The district attorney acknowledged that while Sarah had broken the law, her case was different from many stolen valor situations, where people fraudulently claimed service to obtain financial benefits or professional opportunities. He said he would consider alternative sentencing options, but he needed something that would satisfy the community's need for justice, while also addressing the Admiral's concerns about mental health and restoration. Admiral Sullivan then revealed the second part of his plan, the part that would truly surprise everyone. He offered to work with Sarah personally, if she was willing, to help her understand the real military community and find an authentic way to contribute. He proposed creating a program where Sarah would work with genuine veterans organizations, not pretending to be something she wasn't, but serving in ways that honored those who had actually served. The room fell silent at this proposal. A Navy SEAL admiral volunteering to mentor the woman who had fraudulently claimed to be a SEAL? It seemed almost impossible to believe. David Martinez, the Army veteran, asked the admiral directly why he would do such a thing when Sarah had disrespected everything he and his fellow SEALs stood for. Admiral Sullivan's answer was simple, but profound. He said that the SEAL teams had taught him many things, but one of the most important was that leadership meant making hard choices based on what was right, not what was easy or popular. He believed that Sarah Mitchell was a wounded person who had made terrible choices, but that with proper help and guidance, she could potentially become someone who made genuine contributions to the community she had wronged. He added that the measure of a community's strength wasn't only in how it celebrated its heroes or punished its wrongdoers, but also in how it dealt with broken people seeking redemption. The military had given him purpose and saved his life in ways beyond just physical survival. If there was a chance that a different approach could help Sarah, while also serving as a model for addressing the root causes of stolen valor, wasn't it worth trying? The meeting ended without full agreement, but Admiral Sullivan had planted seeds that would grow in the coming weeks. News of the Admiral's position leaked to the media, causing immediate controversy. Veterans groups were divided. Some praised the Admiral for taking a compassionate and innovative approach. Others accused him of betraying his fellow SEALs and being too lenient on someone who had committed a serious offense. Sarah Mitchell learned about the Admiral's proposal through her attorney, Rachel Torres, who could barely believe what she was reading in the communication from the district attorney's office. Sarah sat in stunned silence as Rachel explained that one of the most respected Navy SEAL admirals in the service had reviewed her case and was proposing an alternative to traditional prosecution. For the first time since her arrest, Sarah felt something other than shame and despair. She felt confused, certainly, but also the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't end with her life being completely destroyed. But she also felt terrified. What if she couldn't live up to this opportunity? What if she failed again? Rachel advised Sarah that accepting the Admiral's proposal would mean publicly acknowledging her wrongdoing, undergoing extensive psychological evaluation and treatment, performing hundreds of hours of community service, and working directly with the veterans community under the Admiral's guidance. It would mean facing the people she had deceived and finding ways to genuinely make amends. It would not be an easy path. Sarah asked for time to think about it. She spent sleepless nights wrestling with the decision. Part of her wanted to just plead guilty, accept whatever punishment the court gave her, and disappear from public view. The shame of what she had done felt overwhelming, and the idea of facing it directly seemed almost impossible. But another part of her, the part that had originally drawn her to the veterans community, even if she had gone about it in the worst possible way, recognized that Admiral Sullivan was offering her something incredibly rare. He was offering her a chance, not just for punishment or even forgiveness, but for genuine transformation and the opportunity to earn the respect she had previously stolen. Sarah's parents visited her, and they talked long into the night about what she should do. Her father, a quiet man who had worked in construction his whole life, told her that he had made his own share of mistakes and that what mattered was not just acknowledging them, but working to make them right. Her mother held her hand and cried, not with disappointment, but with a complex mixture of grief for what had happened and hope for what might come next. After a week of agonizing consideration, Sarah made her decision. She would accept the Admiral's proposal if the court and the veterans community would allow it. She would face what she had done, submit to treatment for the psychological issues that had driven her behavior, and spend however long it took to make genuine amends and find an authentic way to honor and support those who had truly served. Rachel Torres drafted a formal response, accepting the terms that Admiral Sullivan and the district attorney's office had outlined. The proposal would still require approval from the judge, and there would be a hearing where victims and community members could voice their opinions. The path forward was far from certain, but at least there was a path. Admiral Sullivan received word of Sarah's decision while on a training visit to a SEAL facility in Virginia. His aide, who still harbored doubts about the entire approach, asked the Admiral what he hoped would come from this unconventional intervention. Sullivan looked out at young SEAL candidates training on the beach and said something that his aide would remember for years afterward. He said that in his decades of service, he had learned that some battles were won with overwhelming force, but others required a different kind of strength. The battle to build a better society, to address the brokenness that led people to make terrible choices, required the courage to try new approaches even when they were unpopular. If this worked, if Sarah could be helped and transformed, it might offer insights into preventing similar situations in the future. And if it didn't work, they would have at least tried something more than just punishment and rejection. The courthouse was packed on the day of Sarah's hearing. The judge had allowed community input before making a decision about whether to accept the alternative sentencing proposal that Admiral Sullivan had helped craft. Local television crews set up cameras outside, and the story had gained national attention as an unusual case of stolen valor meeting an unexpected response from military leadership. Sarah sat at the defendant's table wearing simple civilian clothes, her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller somehow than she had in the uniform she had worn illegally. Her attorney, Rachel Torres, had prepared her for what was coming, but nothing could fully prepare someone for facing a room full of people they had wronged. Judge Margaret Chen called the hearing to order and explained the unusual circumstances of the case. She noted that while Sarah had pleaded guilty to violating the Stolen Valor Act, there was a proposal before the court for an alternative sentence that differed significantly from typical punishment for such offenses. She stated that before making her decision, she would hear from members of the community, including veterans who had been affected by Sarah's deception. The first person to speak was Tom Harrison, the retired Marine who had first noticed inconsistencies in Sarah's story and reported her. Tom walked to the microphone with the bearing of someone who had spent years in military service. He spoke clearly and directly about how betrayed he felt when he learned that Sarah had been lying. He talked about friends he had lost in combat, about the genuine sacrifices that military members and their families made, and about how Sarah's fraud diminished all of that. Tom's words were powerful and painful, and Sarah felt tears sliding down her face as she listened. But then Tom said something that surprised many people in the courtroom. He said that while he believed Sarah needed to face consequences for what she had done, he had thought a lot about Admiral Sullivan's proposal over the past weeks. Tom admitted that revenge wouldn't bring back his fallen friends or erase what Sarah had done. He said he was willing to support the alternative sentence if Sarah genuinely committed to making amends and getting the help she clearly needed. Several other veterans spoke, expressing a range of views. David Martinez, the Army veteran who had been skeptical at the initial meeting with Admiral Sullivan, spoke about his own struggles with belonging after leaving the service. He acknowledged that while Sarah's method was completely wrong, her underlying desire to be part of something meaningful wasn't entirely foreign to him. He said he would be watching carefully to see if she honored the opportunity she was being given. Jennifer Walsh, the retired Navy corpsman, spoke about her experience of visiting veterans in the hospital with Sarah before the truth came out. She described how Sarah had sat with an elderly Korean War veteran for hours, just listening to his stories when he had no family who visited anymore. Jennifer's voice cracked as she said that Sarah's deception had stolen something precious, but that maybe there was a kernel of genuine caring buried beneath the lies that could be cultivated into something real and good. Not everyone was supportive. Several veterans argued passionately that accepting the alternative sentence would set a dangerous precedent and send a message that stolen valor wasn't taken seriously. One veteran, a retired Army officer named Colonel William Bradford, stated firmly that the military justice system would never be so lenient with such behavior, and civilian courts shouldn't be either. He argued that compassion was admirable, but that some lines, once crossed, demanded clear and harsh consequences. The prosecution presented their case, with District Attorney Robert Caldwell walking a careful line between his duty to enforce the law and his willingness to consider Admiral Sullivan's proposal. He acknowledged the valid concerns raised by those who felt the alternative sentence was too lenient, but he also noted that the law allowed for judicial discretion in sentencing, especially when there were mitigating circumstances and genuine prospects for rehabilitation. Then Admiral Sullivan was called to speak. The courtroom fell silent as he walked to the front, his decorated uniform drawing every eye. Judge Chen acknowledged his rank and service with respect, before asking him to share his perspective on the case. The Admiral spoke without notes, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led men in combat, but also the compassion of someone who understood human frailty. He began by addressing the victims directly, acknowledging their pain and the validity of their anger. He stated clearly that what Sarah had done was wrong and that he in no way condoned her actions or wanted to minimize the offense. But then he talked about leadership and what he had learned over decades of service. He spoke about a young sailor he had once served with who had made a terrible mistake that could have cost lives. The sailor had been given a second chance under strict conditions, and he had gone on to save multiple lives in combat operations. Admiral Sullivan said that leadership sometimes meant taking calculated risks on people, especially when the alternative was simply discarding them. He talked about the broader issue of stolen valor and why people committed it. Some did it for financial gain or professional advantage, and those cases deserved harsh punishment. But others, like Sarah, seemed driven by psychological needs and a desperate desire for belonging. Punishing them without addressing the underlying issues wouldn't prevent future cases. The Admiral proposed that Sarah's case could become a model for a different approach, one that combined accountability with genuine rehabilitation. Admiral Sullivan made a commitment that stunned the courtroom. He said that if the court accepted the alternative sentence, he would personally oversee Sarah's community service and mentor her through the process of making genuine amends. He would use his own time and reputation to help ensure that this experiment in restorative justice succeeded, or to acknowledge publicly if it failed. He was putting his credibility on the line for someone who had disrespected everything he had spent his life defending. The Admiral concluded by saying that the SEAL ethos included the phrase, "I will never quit." He said that applied not just to combat but to the fight to build a better society. Giving up on people who could potentially be rehabilitated was a form of quitting. He believed in accountability, but he also believed in redemption when it was earnestly sought and hard-won. When Admiral Sullivan finished speaking and returned to his seat, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Judge Chen asked if Sarah wished to make a statement before the court. Rachel Torres had advised her client to keep any statement brief and sincere, without making excuses. Sarah stood, her legs shaking, and approached the microphone. Her voice was barely above a whisper at first. but she forced herself to speak clearly. She said that there were no words adequate to express her regret for what she had done. She had stolen something that wasn't hers to take, the honor and recognition that belonged only to those who had genuinely served. She had hurt people who had done nothing but welcome her into their community. Sarah talked about her life, not as an excuse, but as an explanation. She spoke about growing up without a sense of belonging, about struggling with depression and feeling invisible in the world. When she had first been mistaken for a veteran and felt that sudden warmth of recognition and respect, something inside her had broken in a new way. Instead of correcting the mistake, she had leaned into it, building a false identity that temporarily filled the emptiness she felt. But that temporary filling had come at a terrible cost. Sarah said that she had betrayed people who deserved better, and she had disrespected those who had made real sacrifices. She acknowledged that she deserved punishment, and that some people might never forgive her. But if the court gave her the opportunity that Admiral Sullivan had helped create, she pledged to spend however long it took to make genuine amends and to become someone who honored veterans through authentic service rather than stolen lies. Sarah concluded by saying that she had learned that belonging couldn't be stolen or faked. It had to be earned through genuine contribution and authentic relationships. If given the chance, she would spend the rest of her life trying to earn even a small measure of the respect she had fraudulently claimed. Judge Chen called a brief recess to consider everything she had heard. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as people debated what the judge would decide. Some remained convinced that traditional punishment was the only appropriate response. Others found themselves moved by the possibility of a different approach, though many were cautious about whether it would actually work. When court reconvened, Judge Chen delivered her decision. She stated that she had never encountered a case quite like this one, where such a serious offense was met with such an unusual proposal for resolution. She acknowledged the valid concerns of those who believed the alternative sentence was too lenient and might set a problematic precedent. However, Judge Chen said that after careful consideration, she was willing to approve the alternative sentencing plan with modifications. Sarah would be sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation with strict conditions. She would undergo mandatory psychological evaluation and treatment for as long as her therapist deemed necessary. She would perform 1,000 hours of community service, all of it with genuine veterans organizations and all of it under supervision. Most significantly, Sarah would be required to give presentations at schools and community organizations about her case, honestly sharing what she had done and why it was wrong. She would become, in effect, a cautionary tale and an educator about stolen valor. If she violated any conditions of her probation or failed to complete the requirements, she would face immediate incarceration. Judge Chen looked directly at Sarah and said that this was not mercy. It was an opportunity to transform a terrible mistake into something that might prevent others from making similar choices and help heal the community she had harmed. But the work required would be harder than serving time in prison because it would demand that Sarah face what she had done every single day and work to make it right. The judge also thanked Admiral Sullivan for his willingness to be involved in such an unconventional approach to justice. She said that his commitment to helping Sarah demonstrated the best of military leadership, and that the court would rely on his oversight as part of the sentencing structure. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some veterans in the courtroom nodded in approval, while others shook their heads in disagreement. The media coverage that followed was similarly divided, with headlines ranging from "Admiral's Compassion Offers New Approach to Stolen Valor" to "Judge Goes Too Easy on Military Imposter." In the weeks and months that followed, Sarah began the difficult work of fulfilling the terms of her sentence. Her first meeting with Admiral Sullivan was terrifying. She had expected him to be cold or harsh, but instead, he was direct and honest. He told her that she had a long road ahead and that there would be days when she wanted to quit. But if she was genuinely committed to making amends, he would help her find a way. Sarah began attending therapy sessions where she worked on understanding the psychological issues that had driven her behavior. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Myers, helped her explore her lifelong struggle with identity and belonging. Through difficult sessions, Sarah began to understand that her false military persona had been a way of creating the identity she wished she had. Rather than doing the harder work of building a genuine identity based on her real experiences and contributions. The community service was emotionally brutal. Sarah worked in veterans organizations where everyone knew who she was and what she had done. Some veterans refused to work with her or speak to her beyond basic courtesy. Others watched her with skeptical eyes, waiting to see if her remorse was genuine or just another performance. But slowly, through consistent effort and genuine humility, Sarah began to earn small measures of trust. She worked in a program that provided assistance to homeless veterans, doing unglamorous tasks like organizing donations, cleaning facilities, and helping with paperwork. She didn't try to be heroic or stand out. She simply showed up every day and did whatever was needed. Admiral Sullivan met with Sarah monthly, checking on her progress and offering guidance. He introduced her to genuine veterans who shared their own stories of struggle and redemption. He helped her understand that the military community wasn't perfect, that it was full of real people with real flaws who nevertheless found ways to serve something larger than themselves. One of the most difficult requirements was giving presentations about her case. Sarah had to stand in front of high school students, community groups, and veterans organizations and explain what she had done and why it was wrong. These presentations were humbling and often painful. She faced difficult questions and sometimes hostile reactions, but she forced herself to be completely honest about her actions and their impact. During one presentation at a high school, a student asked Sarah why the court had given her what he called a light sentence, instead of sending her to prison. Sarah paused, then explained that nothing about her sentence felt light. She said that prison would have allowed her to hide from what she had done, to serve her time and walk away. Instead, she had to face her victims every day, work alongside the people she had hurt, and constantly confront her own failures. A turning point came about a year into Sarah's probation. She was working at a stand-down event for homeless veterans, helping to organize donations of clothing and supplies. An elderly veteran named Frank, who had served in Vietnam, had been watching her work for several hours. Finally, he approached her and asked if she was the woman who had pretended to be a SEAL. Sarah's heart sank, but she looked Frank in the eye and said yes, she was. She braced herself for anger or rejection. Instead, Frank studied her face for a long moment, then said that he had been homeless himself once, after coming back from Vietnam. He said he knew something about making bad choices and trying to find your way back. Then he asked if she could help him find a coat that might fit. It was a small moment of grace, but it meant everything to Sarah. Frank didn't forgive her or say that what she had done was okay. He simply treated her like a human being capable of change. Over the following months, Sarah continued to encounter small moments like this, veterans who chose to judge her not by her worst mistake, but by her consistent efforts to make amends. Admiral Sullivan watched Sarah's progress with cautious optimism. He reported regularly to the court and to the veterans organizations that had agreed to work with her. He acknowledged that there were setbacks and difficulties, but overall, Sarah was demonstrating genuine commitment to her rehabilitation. More importantly, her story was starting conversations in the veterans community about how to address stolen valor in ways that combined accountability with opportunities for healing. 2 years into her probation, Sarah received an unexpected letter from Tom Harrison, the Marine who had first reported her. Tom wrote that he had been following her progress through mutual acquaintances in the veterans community. He said that while he still believed what she had done was deeply wrong, he respected the hard work she was doing to make amends. He invited her to speak at his local VFW chapter about her experience, not to celebrate her, but to help other veterans understand the complex motivations behind stolen valor and how to respond to it. Sarah accepted the invitation with trepidation. Speaking to a room full of veterans about what she had done was one of the hardest things she had ever faced. But she stood before them and told her story honestly, answering their questions and accepting their judgment. At the end of the presentation, Tom thanked her and said something that brought tears to her eyes. He said that what she had stolen couldn't be returned, but what she was building now through genuine service had its own value. As Sarah approached the end of her probation period, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. She had lost the false identity that had temporarily given her a sense of purpose, but she had gained something more valuable and real. Through her work with veterans organizations, she had found authentic ways to contribute. she had built genuine relationships based on honesty rather than deception. Admiral Sullivan met with Sarah one final time before her probation officially ended. He told her that she had done something rare and difficult. She had faced her worst self and worked to become something better. He said that while she could never undo the harm she had caused, she had demonstrated that redemption was possible through consistent effort and genuine accountability. The Admiral also shared that Sarah's case had sparked important conversations within the military community about how to address stolen valor more effectively. While harsh punishment remained appropriate for cases involving fraud for financial gain, there was growing recognition that some cases reflected deeper psychological and social issues that required different approaches. Sarah completed her 1,000 hours of community service and all her other probation requirements. Judge Chen held a final hearing to officially close the case. In the courtroom that had witnessed her conviction and sentencing 3 years earlier, the judge noted that Sarah had fulfilled every requirement of her alternative sentence and had done so with consistency and apparent sincerity. Judge Chen stated that Sarah's case would remain a controversial example of restorative justice, and that reasonable people could disagree about whether it had been the right approach. But the judge expressed her belief that Sarah had demonstrated genuine change and that her story might help prevent others from making similar mistakes. As Sarah left the courthouse for the final time as a convicted offender, she felt a complex mixture of emotions. The shame of what she had done would never completely leave her, and she had accepted that some people would never forgive her or believe her change was genuine. But she also felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of identity and purpose built on truth rather than lies. Sarah continued working with veterans organizations as a volunteer, no longer because it was required, but because she had found authentic meaning in genuine service. She continued giving presentations about her case, hoping that her painful experience might educate others about the harm of stolen valor and the importance of finding healthy ways to seek belonging and purpose. Admiral Sullivan's intervention in Sarah's case remained a topic of discussion in military circles. Some continued to criticize him for being too lenient on someone who had disrespected the SEAL community. Others praised him for demonstrating that true strength included the courage to try new approaches to complex problems. The Admiral himself rarely spoke publicly about the case, but privately he expressed satisfaction that an experiment in restorative justice had yielded positive results. Years later, Sarah would sometimes think about the moment when Admiral Sullivan had decided to intervene in her case. She knew that his decision had been controversial and that he had risked his reputation to give her a chance at redemption. She wondered what had motivated him to show such unusual compassion to someone who had disrespected everything he represented. In a rare interview about the case, Admiral Sullivan was asked exactly that question. Why had he chosen to help someone who had falsely claimed to be a Navy SEAL? His answer reflected the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime in service and leadership. He said that the SEAL teams had taught him many things, but one of the most important was that every mission required choosing the right tool for the job. Sometimes that meant overwhelming force, but other times it meant precision and careful strategy. He explained that Sarah's case had been an opportunity to try a different strategy for addressing stolen valor. Punishment alone wouldn't have addressed the underlying issues that led her to commit fraud in the first place. By combining accountability with rehabilitation and genuine opportunities for redemption, they had created a model that might be useful in similar cases. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the veterans community was strong enough to respond to betrayal not just with anger, but with wisdom. Admiral Sullivan concluded by saying that military service taught you about sacrifice and commitment, but it also taught you about leadership. Real leadership meant making difficult decisions based on what was right, rather than what was popular. It meant believing that people could change when given proper structure, support, and accountability. His decision to help Sarah had been controversial, but he believed it was the right thing to do, and the results had ultimately supported that belief. Sarah's story became a case study in criminal justice circles, debated in law schools, and discussed in veterans organizations. Some saw it as a successful example of restorative justice that combined accountability with genuine rehabilitation. Others viewed it as a dangerous precedent that might encourage lenient treatment of serious offenses. The truth was probably somewhere in between, a unique case where specific circumstances and an unusual intervention created an outcome that worked but might not be easily replicated. For Sarah herself, the legacy of her crime and her redemption was complex. She would always be the woman who had pretended to be a Navy SEAL, and that truth would follow her for the rest of her life. But she was also the woman who had faced what she had done, worked to make amends, and found an authentic way to serve and honor those who had genuinely sacrificed for their country. She had learned that belonging couldn't be stolen but had to be earned, and that genuine identity came from honest contribution rather than false claims. The veterans who worked with Sarah during and after her probation had mixed views about her transformation. Some remained skeptical, believing that her change was more about avoiding prison than genuine remorse. Others saw authentic growth and appreciated her consistent efforts to make amends. Most fell somewhere in the middle, recognizing that Sarah had done something terribly wrong, but also acknowledging that she had worked hard to become something better. Admiral Sullivan's reaction to Sarah's case, the response that had silenced so many people who expected simple condemnation and harsh punishment, had been rooted in a deeper understanding of human nature and the possibilities of redemption. His willingness to see beyond the immediate offense to the broken person beneath, and to offer a path toward genuine transformation, rather than just punishment, reflected a kind of leadership that transcended military rank or position. In the end, Sarah's story was about many things: the pain of stolen valor, the power of belonging, the possibility of redemption, and the courage required to choose a difficult path toward making amends rather than simply accepting punishment. It was also about what happened when someone with the moral authority and wisdom of Admiral Sullivan chose to respond to a serious wrong with both accountability and compassion, creating a moment where justice and mercy met in an unexpected way. The case reminded everyone involved that while laws and punishments were necessary, they were not always sufficient to address the complex human problems that led to criminal behavior. Sometimes true justice required looking deeper, asking harder questions, and being willing to try new approaches even when they were controversial. And sometimes, in rare cases where all the right elements came together, those new approaches could create outcomes that served both justice and human transformation in ways that traditional punishment alone could never achieve.